Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. The care economy includes paid, so employed in the formal and informal sectors, and unpaid work, through which care is provided to others. Care responsibilities can be broadly categorised into two groups, those carried out within the home and those performed outside it. To talk about the potential role of artificial intelligence in the future care economy, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Houston-based futurist Alexandra Whittington. Alex, a warm welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you with us again.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be back.
So, this issue of the care economy then, what role do you think artificial intelligence might play in the evolution of the care economy over the near, mid and long term? Because there's an interesting evolution, I think, across those timeframes potentially, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think that, we're going to see the same pattern with a lot of things, not just the care economy, that AI can initially sort of, start supporting with, understanding data, interpreting information, supporting our decision making and stuff like that. But in the longer term, I think it will have a stronger effect of enhancing, human caring. And by that, I mean, it will be able to take over some of the stuff that people now have to do, whether it's teaching or in the healthcare setting or, in a home healthcare type setting. There are certain things that you just can't see being off-sourced to a robot. And you wouldn't want to see that, right? Things like relating, right? Like having a personal relationship. It's fine if elderly people find that, talking to an AI, or, if people dealing with mental health find that a chat bot can be a useful source of support. I'm not opposed to that at all. But it's reasonable to think that that will always be sort of something a human being can do, right? If we allow the space for it. So I think that, AI will help with giving people the time and the energy and avoid the kind of career burnout that results in professionals avoiding that emotional connection that we know is so important in the caring professions. And even in the caring roles, just think of the working mom, the working dad, right? Something we can all relate to. If AI can take off some of what they like to call, for example, I think it's referred to as mental load. And it's this idea that's really well talked about in the feminist community, the motherhood community, the idea that we have to go around remembering everything, right? We have to remember the lunch money and the birthday parties and the aunt's birthday and the holidays and the planning and the volunteering and the appointments, you name it, right? Our brains are overflowing with details. So, and that can be impactful, maybe not in a good way, on our relationships with people, right? With real people that we really want to have good relationships with. So I'm optimistic that AI can ultimately, take off some of that mental load and transform, like, the human experience by saying, you don't have to be a stressed out, burnt out single mom or whatever it might be, right? Or a stressed out, burnt out nurse that's, overloaded with work. If we can overcome those sorts of like systemic challenges with AI, I think that's the ultimate goal. But in the meantime, it's probably going to be, note taking, interpreting information, helping us make decisions, and having a human oversight on that sort of thing.
So it struck me as you were talking there that initially, I guess, we're talking about improved efficiency and effectiveness from the caregiver's perspective, and particularly a caregiver association. And then it seems as those AI agents become more sophisticated and perhaps more human-like, there could potentially be a point in the future where there's a sort of a handover from a real human to a pretend human. Is that how you see that progression potentially moving?
I mean, in some regards, yes. I mean, I think that there may be, some sort of robotic incarnations of these AIs, that can interact with you, that can understand you. And that could be really useful in the short term, for example, filling or let's say in the midterm, filling the, skills gap, the talent gap, so to speak, because that is something that's very real.
Yeah.
Teachers, healthcare workers, nurses, you name it. There's not enough of them to deal with the kind of demographic let's say, shocks, changes, instabilities that could be in store that have to do with aging population, but also a more diverse population. And I might add a post-COVID population, because even the biggest, most mainstream news sources and research institutes are confirming that long COVID is having an effect on the economy, right? On the ability to fill jobs and fill caretaker roles. And those two things are extremely interrelated. I mean, it's one of the things the pandemic highlighted. So I think the skills gap, whether it's a professional or a informal, like home caregiving situation, could be supplemented with robotic humanoid type replacements. But I think the catch here is that we're typically talking about some of our most vulnerable populations, children, sick people, old people, elderly, you name it. Maybe people who, are various special populations when it comes to abilities, whether it's mental or physical. So that's going to be an important consideration. We're not just going to hand over children to a robot until we're pretty sure they're in safe hands, right? So we're pretty
Yes.
sure, and it's been pretty tested. So this area of the care economy, I think, has the advantage of being very experimental, because we get to test out these different extremely human and extremely universal situations of caring, of teaching, of learning and healing and recovery, and these kinds of very human experiences and skills. So we'll get to see how to use it safely and well when we experiment within this care economy context.
And I think we started to touch on this, but how do you think these developments might shift the perception of the value of care work? Because, certainly in the UK, care workers generally tend to be paid at the lower end of many pay scales, which, on the face of it, seems a little bit odd. We want to pay people very small amounts of money in order to look after the people that mean most to us. So, yeah, how do these developments affect the perceived value of the care work, both from the point of view of the recipient of the care, but also the care providers?
Yeah, I think that's a really important consideration that's coming into play more and more as people understand the role that the care provider plays in upholding the entire economy. Because as we saw during the pandemic, um, the workforce became very unstable when schools were closed, right? And schools are sort of a de facto childcare for kids, over a certain age. So once we saw that, schools were closed, parents couldn't, go to work essentially. That put a real, disruption into place. And now that we understand that caregiving, and then you could also talk about the same story in the pandemic. I know I sound like a broken record talking about COVID, but with the healthcare workers, right? There was this nursing shortage, we have health emergency, and we see how the healthcare system is basically hanging by a thread. We have similar situation in the healthcare industry where these professionals who we see as so essential are not necessarily paid that well. Maybe less so in healthcare than childcare and education. But in any case, we now that we understand the role it plays in the bigger picture, I think that's a really good argument for paying more and investing in technology that's not just, surveillance or something, that really is impersonal and dehumanizing, but something that can foster the type of culture that we want to have, the type of society that we want to have, not just some, corporate robot strolling the halls of the schoolway, keeping kids in line or something, but something that can truly enhance the learning experience. I mean, another demographic change that's on the horizon is the smaller number of kids in society. And I think it's going to take time for that to kind of sink in and become real, because these demographic shifts don't happen overnight. It happens over years and decades. But children may become, at least in the Western world and most of the Western world, or maybe even most of the world, children might be very valuable, right? There'll be so fewer of them, right?
Yeah.
There so many fewer numbers, right? So in that sense, you might not want to turn over a classroom of kids to a robot or just some camera or some AI system, because you might think, gosh, it would be a privilege to be able to teach this one class of kids that in my town, whereas we used to have 10 schools, but now we've got one group of kindergartners. I mean, this is becoming
Yeah.
a reality in some places 10, 15 years from now. So the idea of being in a classroom full of kids, as a caregiver or a teacher, might be a very attractive career option, might be very exotic and unique, and possibly very well paid. So that's the kind of transformation I'm interested in, as a futurist, thinking about how can things really be different from today.
I guess one of the kind of flips almost that happens there is, and I suppose it's something as futurists we've been talking about a long time, it's kind of this shift, isn't it, from a more physical skill base to something that's more emotional and human based. And the other thing that strikes me is that from a demographic perspective, I suppose we're used in the past to seeing children growing up to be capable of looking after their older relatives. And if that doesn't happen, then that creates an issue that perhaps some of these technologies we're talking about could help fulfill.
For sure, for sure. So one of the things, byproducts, consequences, implications
Yeah.
of this demographic shift is smaller families. I mean, the families that do have children are more likely to have one, not two or three. So what's interesting about that, I was reading an article, I think it was in the Atlantic, that explored this idea is, the single child family, right? You're not going to have these dynamics that a lot of us grew up with, which is like, having the older child and the middle sibling and all those personality shaping factors, and not a lot of cousins, right? So it's going to be people who are growing up in a very small family with not a lot of uh, uh, relatives in their age group, and it's really just going to be on that one person to care for their aging parents or aging aunts and uncles and so forth. And so yes, I think that makes a really good case for technological backup, so to speak, because the lack of congruence there.
And I guess the other potential driver for introducing new technologies into the sector is the ability or willingness of different kind of care systems to actually fund the care of the future. So I guess that could be another driver to introduce kind of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week technology, which can do some of the work that we don't have to pay, all those variable humans for.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's a cost advantage. But we also have to look at the social cost of turning over these very human jobs to robots, right? It needs to be thoughtful. And I guess that was my rationale for the idea that, this is a great opportunity to understand how to implement these things humanely.
Um, think about these things humanely. I think when we're talking about care is probably precisely the sort of point we want to end on. Alex, thank you so much for that. I think that was really, really fascinating. And as ever, when we see the coming together, the tension, if you like, that's created between technological advancement and our basic humanity, it creates both challenges as well as opportunities, doesn't it?
In terms of those challenges and opportunities, I would say, for the gender stereotypes, and this is something I know you and I have talked about before, and probably will talk about again, but there's this really strong stereotype about care being women's work, right? And it's based
Yeah.
on historical reality, right? And it's based on current reality. I wouldn't call it historical. I mean, there are surveys and studies of contemporary society that shows that women do most of the caring work. So I think that anytime you bring technology into the fray, you're potentially inviting more of a gender balance to take place. So I'm just saying, if being a nurse one day is considered an IT job, right? Because it's so software and robotics and whatever, involved with all that kind of stuff. Um, then that changes the landscape, right? Because first of all, we know IT jobs pay a lot better than nursing jobs
Yes.
these days. And we know that most nursing jobs, teaching jobs, all these care economy professions are filled by women, as well as the informal roles taking place in the home tend to be occupied by mothers, daughters, sisters, or paid female caregivers in the home. So yeah, I think that the technological aspect that can change the nature of the work and that can bring in these different aspects, because people who are interested in an AI career might not think they want to go into elder care or something like that, but that might be where they end up going into. So I think, that is one of the opportunities to transform long held biases and assumptions about the type of work that is appropriate, that men do and the type of work that women do, the gender division of labor, right? Challenging that is an opportunity. But I think, the challenge exists that I kind of mentioned earlier is that we put some of our most vulnerable populations at risk when we introduce AI, robots, digital, metaverse or whatever to children and older people. So there's a lot of considerations there when it comes to consent, to awareness. And I think that is a challenge, not just for the innovation side, but for society. It's something that's going to be ironed out through what policies, through government involvement, through, social norms evolving and whatnot. So that's, while interesting, I think it poses, a challenge.
And one of the things that you touched on there, the importance of considering gender, is something that we talk about in another episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, either there or there, will be a link to that episode where we think about gender. Alex, that's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll see you again.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for watching or listening to this latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a future episode, and do tell your friends and colleagues all about the podcast. I'll see you on another episode very soon.